So now we move on to sophomore year. I lived in Istanbul for the most part of the first semester, which was an amazing experience in and of itself. But before the school year even started, I took a road trip down to Antalya to see the beach and just to explore the area, and it was probably one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. Though the 100-degree weather was a little rough, we got to explore a lot of places and ruins and even went snorkeling at some point to see some of the local fish life. You're obviously not new here, this is video 2, but that was my favorite part. I obviously also looked at the inland freshwater streams and was surprised to find a puddle with tadpoles in it, less than 50 feet from the ocean. I can't help but wonder what species they were and if they were able to handle higher salinity than freshwater amphibians I was used to, or how that system kind of worked. But that sort of small thing is incredible, and I'm really glad I was able to have this experience despite the pandemic. I do want to note that we were extremely careful, and the place that we stayed at was distanced from other people. We mostly kept to ourselves. Even at the beach, not many people were traveling, and being outside made it easy to keep our distance. When we were going to other places, we made sure to wear our masks and sanitize our hands, so I do want to state that while I was really fortunate to be traveling, we were also very cautious, especially at the beginning of the pandemic when nobody was quite sure what was going on. Once we got back to Istanbul, me and 2 other classmates actually settled into our apartment. One of the first things that I did was find a fish store, and I set up a small hydroponic system in the back of the apartment with 2 goldfish and lots of plants. We did live in a smaller town away from some of the touristy areas, so not too many people spoke English. Getting the necessary things to set up the tank was a challenge, and that semester, I was able to explore a completely different culture and live on my own in a foreign country for the very first time. When I was younger, I was fortunate enough to travel pretty frequently. My mom is French, and she always made the effort to make sure we were connected with our heritage and our family. So we visited them as often as we could. She also placed a huge emphasis on international exposure, so we visited a lot of other places when we got the chance, and I also saved all throughout high school so that after graduating, I could travel through Europe with my best friend. We lived in hostels and ate bread with peanut butter and carrots for our meals, but it was really the first time I was living alone. It's really far from my support network, and I didn't speak the language, but it was still an incredible experience. Me and my love for linguistics and languages, I really wanted to learn more about how Turkish is structured as a language and, the different grammatical pieces and the subject-verb order, which is different than it is in English. But I was really able to immerse myself in a new culture and learn more about the world around me. I worked hard to learn Turkish, and by the end of the 3 months, I was able to communicate very basic desires and questions, like please hand me that, or like thank you, where's the restroom? And I consider it a win. But one thing that really stood out to me, besides all the cats and the dogs that freely roamed, was the affordable healthcare. That was just something that was very shocking to me. I then went to France to apply for my visa. Minerva had canceled our original rotation city, is what they call the cities that we live in for the semester, for the first semester, which is where I had spent it in Istanbul, but the second semester was still happening. While originally we were supposed to go to Hyderabad in India and then Seoul, South Korea, they canceled India, which I was really sad about, but thankful that they also didn't cancel our Seoul semester. While I was there, I really cracked down on the database. Right before we left for Seoul, we were living in the countryside, and there wasn't a lot to do, especially during the pandemic, so I dedicated most of my time and energy to setting up a MVP, minimum viable product, on Notion using the CARES website and conducting some more interviews. After about 50 to 100 hours of work constructing that database and brainstorming ideas, I had the foundations for my project. So I had a Notion database with all the details about the warehouse, space calculations, energy calculations based off of different square footages, which species would be good targets, what I wanted to work with, which permits I needed, what plants I could pair with it if I wanted to do aquaponics. It was just really satisfying to see everything start to come together. It's in these phases where something goes from an idea to a project, because there are lots of good ideas, but getting started on that project is kind of the hardest part. Now, though I'm sure I'll say that a couple times throughout the video about something being the hardest part, they're all kind of difficult, but it is what it is. After the winter break, I flew to Seoul and started the new semester. This time was really a struggle for me as well, because we started with a 2-week solo isolation. These quarantines were in special hotels with alarms on the doors, so you could only open them for a few seconds at a time to get the food that was delivered to you. It was delivered straight in front of your door, and trash was picked up the same way. You also had to take and register your temperature twice a day, and by the end of the quarantine, we had to have 2 negative COVID tests. So they did one after 5 days and one right before we were released. I'm a really social person. This period was really difficult for me because I really missed human interaction, and I have to say that I did struggle mentally a lot during those first 2 weeks. Me and my classmates were all in the same building, so we would sometimes try and talk to each other when we had our windows open, And every afternoon we would do dance exercises together on Zoom. And a lot of people coordinated joint study groups, but it still doesn't replace the real thing. But once I managed to escape the quarantine, I really loved Seoul. So people would leave food out on displays and even the keys in the ignition because of how safe it was. Like I could leave my laptop in a cafe to go use the restroom and know it would still be there when I got back. And that was probably one of the biggest culture shocks of being there. Besides that, they also sold freshwater fish as pets in grocery stores, which I'm not sure how I feel about, but the care was still better than what it used to be in places like Walmart. It was actually a pretty good display. It was more like a PetSmart than a Walmart. That being said, PetSmart is not necessarily the best in terms of freshwater fish care, so take that how you will. There's a pretty significant language barrier here, so while I was able to find the fish stores, I wasn't able to ask much about the community, and it seemed like they were kept more as decorations rather than part of a hobby. There were arowana for sale, which I was really jealous about, and even sturgeon, which I think a lot of people had ponds and were actually able to keep them, but I'm not too sure. While I was living there, I got to see cherry blossoms bloom, and I got to visit so many amazing areas, and despite the pandemic, it was a pretty great semester. And it seemed to fly by, and before I knew it, it was summer again. But this time, instead of fish, I fostered a litter of 4 puppies and their mother. When I was younger, I had always wanted a dog. My parents knew that it was a poor choice for our family, but I really wanted one anyways. And finally, over the summer, I had the opportunity to have dogs living in the house for the first time, and they were a handful. But I learned a lot about puppy care and how clean they were not. Thankfully, it wasn't too long before they figured out the puppy pads, and their mom was the sweetest thing I've ever seen. The month that we took care of them was the most hectic summer I've ever had, but it was also the best. They had me on a consistent sleep schedule. They were going outside all the time so we could play. And, we did early training with them to get them used to being handled, and they learned how to sit before getting food once we started to wean them. And, we named the puppies after pasta sauces. So everyone in my family had a favorite puppy. And while this isn't directly related to fish, that it really reinforced that I knew that I wanted to spend my life surrounded by animals. They brought me so much joy, and even when one tore her stitches out from her spay the day she was supposed to go to her new home, the experience was just really amazing. That's pretty much a wrap. From exploring Antalya's beautiful beaches to setting up a hydroponic system in my apartment in Istanbul to quarantining in a hotel in Seoul. The second year of Minerva was a period for development and exploration. And I can't wait to share more with you in the future about my fish keeping journey and the way that it's impacted my life.